Hi, this is Scarlet. I'm not really good at this, but I decided to upload another video here because last week I published a book review on my blog. The link is down below the video. And I have actually reviewed a German book named Still Lost in Panama, Slip we call it. It came out on April 1st of this year. It's written by two German authors, Christian Hardinghaus and Annette Nenner. They've researched the Chris and Lisanne case another time, I should say, because they're not the first authors to do so. But like the others, they managed to get copies of the case files. And what's interesting is that this Annette Nenner also spent several months in Boquete herself. So actually, I bought the book. I was quite interested in their findings because on their website they promised quite a lot of new information and also tackling the information provided by previous authors, so that really got my interest. And I read this book together with two fellow sleuths called Dave and Power Pixie, and together we looked quite closely into the claims that have been made by these German authors. I have a really long detailed blog post made about this, but in order to make it a bit easier for people to learn about our main findings, I now also make a video here because I do understand that not everyone has the time or whatever reason to not go through that entire post. So I'll give you a summary of the book and of our opinions here. But if you want, well, of course, the detailed analysis, you can read my blog. The link's down in the description. So what Power Pixie, Dave and I have done is actually going through each chapter of this book. We've done so by comparing these claims from Hardinghaus and Nenner, the authors, with the claims of another book from two Dutch authors, which was already published in 2021, I think it was in May. And I never really made a review of that for all sorts of reasons, but we do refer to that book and some of its claims in this review because we can compare. Both authors had the case files, but they come to different conclusions sometimes, which is interesting. And we also compared their claims with the podcast series and articles of Jeremy Cried, came out in 2022. I won't say we were fans of it, but we quite liked the podcast series because of all the new details that came out and the fact that Margarita, the mother of Osman Valenzuela, who died and turns out he was murdered, she just came with so many new angles to this case. Not everyone will believe her, but we think that Jeremy Cry did a really good job in that podcast series, as well as in his earlier Daily Beast articles. So yeah, they are just, I'm not going to say they are telling the truth, but it's interesting that all sets of people had access to these case files, and yet we don't get one similar story. It's like every single author or author duo has highlighted different aspects and also twisted some details. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And of course, another way to test these claims, often also made by people in recent interviews and not, the ones made at the beginning. Both Juan and myself, we have spent a lot of time and energy documenting everything that's been said from the get-go. So early interviews, both on camera and in newspapers, in articles, not just interviews, of course, but all sorts of research that was done from the beginning. A lot of that has since been taken off the internet, especially by bigger newspapers. So we're really happy that we documented everything. And it is a way also to now check what people who play a role in this case say nowadays to author duos or what they said in the beginning. And I can already give you a spoiler warning because they don't always match up. And then at the end of this video, we'll also share what Dave and Power Pixie and myself believe and think about a lot of things. For the most part, I will try to just tell you what they say in my own words, but I will also use some book quotes when necessary, when they are relevant to us and our case discussions, keeping the fair use principle inside. So for those of you who did not read the book, this will mean that we will jump from subject to subject a lot, which is much less fluent, of course, than how it's presented in the book, but you can also purchase the book and read for yourself. So something else that's quite interesting to us is that at the moment only a really small group of people seem to have copies of these case files. In principle, they are not supposed to be traded or sold, they're confidential, but nevertheless, there is this small group of people who seem to get access to these copies, mainly authors who were given them, anonymous sources as far as we don't know who gave it to them, although we have our suspicions sometimes. Some people also paid for them, quite a lot actually, a lot of money. So you have the situation now where a small group have these case files and can quote from them, but then us, public basically, we do not have those files. So even the source links that are very well written here in this book, they are not used by the Dutch authors, but these German authors do a very good job in just scientifically reporting and just referring to whatever page or specific source they quote. But because we do not have the copies, it's like, yeah, it's great, these source notes, but they're not useful because we cannot check, we cannot read them for ourselves, and we can also not see. I mean, I believe that these quotes are made perfectly and they're not made up, but sometimes people can also take a few sentences out of a whole context and we cannot verify that either. So that is a really strange situation with this case, I think. I mean, it's already a complex case with lots of twists and turns and things that don't add up. But to, on top of that, have Bedside of Pity, the prosecutor at the time, who was fired from her job in January 2015, so within a year. She apparently had these case files and has given them to some people. I won't say who, but it's quite obvious who got those case files from her. And I won't say it's illegal, but it's strange. It would be great if somehow these files made it to the public. Normally you would say it's confidential and it shouldn't be, but so many people have now already access to those files and using them for commercial books now, to author duos and podcasts and whatnot, that there comes a point where, as other sleuths or as the public, it's getting a bit annoying basically, that we just cannot hold them accountable for how they interpret those files. So that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, so I'll try not to refer to that as much as I do on the blog, but just for context here. I just opted to make a video of this because at least people can listen to it while they're doing other things, whereas actively reading a blog is just not for everyone, I suppose. And we did enjoy reading this book, so I just wanted to share that. I'm Dutch, so I have a strong accent. I'm very sorry for anyone whose ears are ringing from that, but I'll try my best to speak decent English. So this book is pretty well written, we thought. It was well structured, it was easy also to read, easy to keep reading, so that was all good. If you roughly look at the end of the reading, what the book consists of, we would say it consists of a section that most of us already knew, basically, the known timeline and anything leading up to this disappearance. But of course it has to be added in a book for those who don't know the case as well. Then roughly speaking, there will be a second section, we say, provides us with new details from the case files. So here the authors tag the Dutch author duo also, as well as the case prosecutor, Bedside of Pity. And they show us also where we have been lied to by them. So this is a really interesting part of the book. Although the authors go in pretty hard sometimes, I don't mind a bit of criticism, but even to my taste, sometimes it got a bit much. So very interesting also. Then there's like a third section, roughly speaking, which deals with new theories of Hardinghouse and Nenner, the authors. And it basically comes down to this one new crime theory they developed, and it revolves around the red truck, which was already known, but not so much about it. And they link it to an inhabitant of the Pianista trail, who they believe is very suspicious and all this. So I'll work that out a bit later in the video. And then roughly a fourth section where Annette Nenner, because she went to Boquete, she interviews some of the members of this local youth gang called the Pandilla, or named the Pandilla. And they have been implicated in the past as having been connected to the disappearance of Chris and Lisanne, mainly by Jeremy Cried and his podcast and the mother of Osman. So Annette manages to speak to them for a short period of time. And here the authors basically try to make a case for the innocence of this group and also the innocence of the tour guide F. Well, they call him by his whole name, but I've always said tour guide F, so everyone knows his real name. But yeah, the book tried to make a case for his innocence, and they do so like continuously, sometimes annoyingly, I feel, but we'll get into that in a minute. What is really good about the book is that they add a lot of new and quite valuable information extracted from these case files. Of course, others before them already did so too, but it seems that they also left out quite a bit. So these people are coming with a vengeance basically to tell us what Betsaida Pitti's biographers failed to tell us. So, for instance, we learn interesting details from the autopsy report. There are some chapters where the authors try to take down other case investigators. And the German authors also share with us which people were interviewed by the investigators after the disappearance. They confirm, based on these police files, which investigational opportunities were missed by Pitti and her team. We also learn that Sina Proc, for instance, went through the girl's bedroom without sticking to forensic rules and regulations, but so did Guide F and Eileen, who went in that room a few days earlier. So if it had been a crime scene, it would have been ruined. Also interesting, we learned that local banks failed or refused to provide CCTV footage when they were asked to do so. So for instance, we know Chris and Lisanne, they carried money with them, cash. So when did they go to the bank to get that money, and how much did they extract, and were they in the habit of doing so? We don't know because the banks refused to provide that. Also quite important, I think, is that the local telecom company also refused to give those details. So, for instance, they could have shown us who else was moving up or down the Pianista with their mobile phones on April 1st, because you can ping that, but no, they wouldn't give that information. So that's confirmed too now. And they also learn in this book, for instance, that Leonardo, the taxi driver who had come forward himself to claim that he drove Chris and Lisanne to the Pianista trailhead, which is debated because his time is not matching the photos. But the book now says that this Leonardo actually went back to investigators for a second interview on April 24th, in which he confessed not to have told them the full truth, and that there were two men in his cab at the time, and that he picked up Chris and Lisanne, and also that he saw an older man on the trail when he left Chris and Lisanne there. Never heard of that one before, so not sure if it's of any importance, but Leonardo, of course, died under suspicious circumstances within a year, drowned. Through this book, we also get a better insight into the initial criminal investigation and just how vital, impactful the discovery of this backpack really was. Because some people say, the backpack, it didn't change the course of the investigation, but the German authors believe that it did. Because they say once that backpack was discovered, it actually had enough power to stop completely planned criminal raid by Betsaida Pitti on a suspect's house the next day. And it was even enough to entirely stop the criminal investigation in total. So we know that it did that. So that is a motive for planting, in theory, a backpack. Not saying that's what happened, but it is a motive they provide, so it's good to have that confirmed. Something which sleuths didn't know yet, but maybe suspected. But now we know for sure. And we also learned some more about the errors made by Pitti. For instance, the many forensic opportunities she squandered. There was no analysis ordered by her for the discovered blue shoe, for instance. Neither of the water bottles. I wrote about that before. There was some water remnants in it. Why didn't she check, the origin of that water? Was it river water? Was it tap water? Was it supermarket water? You could have deduced something out of that, but she just wasn't interested. So that's confirmed too now. Also interesting, Elvis, I think it was. Yeah, Elvis, he He posted a video on YouTube at the time, I'll play it in the background here, of a friend of his, Carlos V, who found a plastic bag at some point during the searches, but it wasn't on the Pianista, but it was close. And this plastic bag, it contained food wrappers, also a pink shoe sole. And the pink kind of matched the color of the inside of Lisanne's shoe. There was also long blonde hair found on that shoe sole. And for some reason, it just disappeared. And Alita Coriat, local journalist, she wrote about it, but then Betsaida Pidi in the Dutch book and in some other interviews, she basically said that Coriat is a liar and it's not true, blah, blah, blah. But now, through the police and the case files, we learn in this book that actually they did disappear while at the hands of the investigators. So yeah, Pity was bullshitting again, basically. We also learn that the 2 mattresses that were found in the same vicinity of this plastic bag, it made the newspapers. There's some photos, I'll show it in the background. But now we learn in this book that neither mattresses were forensically investigated either. They were not checked for DNA. So, I mean, it's so easy. Why not? Even if it's very unlikely that it's linked to the disappearance, how easy is it to just verify it and exclude it? But it just wasn't done. So these authors, they literally, and I quote, call it evidence of serious omissions or inadequate investigative methods by Betsaida Pidi. So that's pretty damning. I mean, it's not everything. There's so much more, but some of the standout things. So another thing they reveal is that Betsaida Pidi waited until the 29th of April to finally have these computers at the language school, Spanish by the River, examined and to create a digital image of the hard disks and the server. So that's almost a month after Chris and Lisanne went missing. And the girl who worked there, the intern, Eileen from Germany, she apparently also said earlier, like, you should check those computers. But for some reason, Betsaida took a whole month, and, you know, with students coming and going there, so many people used those computers in the meantime. So it's just... Is this by design, or is she just incompetent? I don't know. We also learned from this book slip that Chris and Lisanne had Googled specific destinations on these school computers, namely the Pianista Trail and the Pipeline Trail, which at the end has a waterfall. And we're also told that Chris and Lisanne told their Dutch friends from KOUDEKAAS, called Bas and Edwin, on March 31st already that, quote, they were going to the cascade, so to the waterfall. So there is something with waterfalls. They also told Marjolein, so they arrived in Bouquet on the 29th of March, and on Sunday the 30th they already had an introduction speech from Marjolein, and they showed interest in waterfalls, and even their parents said that they were interested to see the hidden waterfalls in Bouquet. So there's also some witnesses came forward who claimed to have seen them talk with locals, 2 local guys, about going to the waterfall. So this is a bit of a recurrent thing, these waterfalls. It may perhaps play a role in why they kept walking while they reached the Mirador. Maybe they believed that if they kept walking, they would reach the hidden waterfalls. Maybe someone told them. It's just a theory, of course, but yeah, they actively showed interest in waterfalls, and there are a couple of them in Bouquet. So something else of interest, they completely break down what sort of money they found in the backpack. So it was $87.55, but they also detail that it were three $20 bills, 2 $10 bills, 1 $5 bill, 2 $1 bills, 5 coins of 25 cents, and 1 5-cent coin. For, you know, completion, it's good to know. The authors also revealed a lot of new details from the NFV report. So the NFV is the Dutch Forensic Institute. And now we know through this book exactly what the NFV received from Pity on June 20th, that was. From Pity and from the public prosecutor's office, basically. Quote, Lisanne's cell phone, her digital camera, her backpack, as well as Chris' cell phone and the bras of the 2 women. And enclosed was a request for mutual legal assistance from the Panamanian government for the, quote, preliminary investigation into an alleged offense of deprivation of liberty against Lisanne Vroon and Chris Kremers. So that's very interesting. An alleged offense of deprivation of liberty. Basically, they were kidnapped. That's what the letter said, written to the NFV. It was drawn up based on the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, actually. So it seems that on June 20th, so a week after this backpack had been found and the criminal searches had been stopped by Pity, she still considered the disappearance a crime based on this letter. So the NFV was officially asked for technical support to read the contents of the electronic devices and to secure DNA profiles or traces of blood on the underwear and the backpack. That's what they were asked to do. That's what they were given permission to do. And that was it, basically. So then on to what I would say is a mini bombshell of sorts, because this book slip now confirms that, quote, the NFV is not informed that Pity's team has already examined, at minimum, the data from the electronic devices. Therefore, the NFV themselves note that some of the photos on the SD card were edited on June 17, 2014. The originals are therefore not available for the NFV's investigation. The NFV investigators are also unaware that text messages and contacts from Lisanne's phone have already been backed up. The Panamanian authorities also refuse to comment on the data recorded by R, quote ends. So yeah, this is, wow. This is something that I have made a case for several years already on my blog, and actually Juan is the one who discovered this and had this correct all along based on what we now learn from this book. And he came to this realization without relying on any case files, because we don't have them. So he discovered years ago already that on the same June 17th, alterations had been made in the EXIF data of these photos of Chris and Lisanne. And this has raised questions with him as well about the authenticity of the photo card as we know it today. So now we learn that those photos with the altered EXIF data were not just sent to the press, were not just the ones that we could download from online newspapers. They were actually the ones that were given to the NFV. So they were delegated with the sole task of examining those phones and the bag, and they were given an SD card that was overwritten by probably Betsaida Pity, because we know she looked at the card on June 17th with her team. So that can't be a coincidence. So basically what she did was they looked at these night photos, but instead of making a copy and then working on copied photos, they worked with the official original SD card. They at least, maybe more, rotated, brightened photos, saved these brightened and rotated versions, overriding the original. And it's just not known how much more they may have done, and whether or not they already saw at the time that file 509 was missing. They have never mentioned that they already saw that at the time. So you can even wonder if at that day, 17th of June, 509 actually disappeared. We don't know. We know that they messed with the SD card basically. And it's quite strange that they sent that SD card to the NFV, claiming to them that they had the delegated task to investigate it. Usually you just send the original. You don't mess with it before you send it to the specialized organization who's delegated to do so. And they also didn't tell them. They didn't add a note like, listen, this is what we did. So very strange. And what's also quite strange is that this book of the Dutch duo who wrote it together with Betsaida Pity, they basically made no mention of this whatsoever. They didn't highlight this problem at all. And notice also that at that time, nobody brought this missing file 509 up in the public, in the press. It took us quite a long time to find out that it was missing. I believe it was in December 2014 that it was first mentioned in Een Vandaag, Dutch program where they talked with some of the NFV people. So, but they must have known it at least half a year ago, but no one told us. They don't have to, but it's quite a significant element to this mystery, this missing file. So why didn't they tell us about it? So what I will do now is go into 4 different subtopics of this book quickly. Namely the red truck, Mr. M living on the Pinista Trail, this disappearing shoe sole, hair and bag with foot wraps, and also the interview with the Pandilla gang. I'll zoom in onto those 4 topics. And then, for who's still interested in listening, I'll continue with a chapter by chapter takedown, which Dave Powerpixie and I made. And then you can just listen to our ramblings if you like. So here we go. So another good subtopic from this book is the confirmation of Hardinghouse and Nenner that Pitty, her team, indeed messed up the handling of the fuchsia shoe sole and the blonde hair, which were found in the search for Chris and Lisanne. Journalists already correctly reported in the Panamanian media about the sudden disappearance of the found hair and the strange treatment, or lack therefore, of the plastic bag and the shoe sole, and all this to the mockery of Pitty and her Lost in the Jungle authors. A newspaper article about this has been removed from the internet since, but I luckily made screen saves of it before they removed it, and you can read much more on this topic on my blog. Unlike the poor coverage of this topic in Lost in the Jungle, we now learn that Pitty and her team indeed lost the blonde hair and destroyed the Romero plastic bag and the shoe sole without having even DNA tested them first. I think this is a very important bit of info, thanks to this book, because it once again shows that Betsaida Pitty was either, in my eyes, incompetent or corrupt. Make your pick. Pitty effectively did the same to the blue shoe of Chris that was found and the water bottles. She refused to have them investigated by the lab and then pretended there was nothing to see there. So this is strange. I mean, people in the lab were literally, they said to the media, they were waiting for that blue shoe to be sent to them so they could do a DNA test on it or any other forensics. But Betsaida never sent it. She was like, it's not necessary. And in that Dutch book, Lost in the Jungle, which she co-authored, they just skip around these topics. They just pick their topics they want to elaborate on. But we don't know why she, mistreated. The same for the water bottles. I wrote a lot about it on my blog, but the same is now said by the German authors. But we could have known what water remnants were in that plastic bottle. She never tested the contents, was the last water they caught in that water bottle, was it from the river, was it tap water, or was it still commercial water from the supermarket? It wouldn't solve this case, but it would have just added another piece of information. So it's unbelievable to me how much Betsaida Pitty has dropped the ball in that respect. But the same goes for this blonde hair, which, it could have been Chris's, we don't know, it wasn't tested. So I already uploaded the video on my YouTube, which was made by Carlos V. He made a video in which he shows finding a plastic bag full of empty food wraps and a fuchsia pink shoe sole with a hair on it. That video, you can watch it on my channel. So now we learn from this book Slip that this Carlos V, who made that video and who found those items, was actually summoned to talk to the police on the evening of April 12th. So it's quite early in the investigation. And this is the same day when he featured in a Dutch news report from RTL 4, also on April 12th, on which he confirmed that together with a plastic Romero bag with food packages, he found a long blonde hair of approximately 60 centimeters in length and the pink shoe sole. At the time, these items were being examined in a laboratory, and this was interesting. Also the shoe sole, because the color of it matched pretty well with the outside pinkness in the wildebeest shoe of Lisanne. But then a day later already, Cineproc General Director Alvarado, he said on national television that the discovery of the hair was just a rumor, even though you can clearly see the hair video when he shows it to the camera. But now we learn in this book that on April 12th already took an oath that he discovered the plastic bag on April 11th at 2 p.m. while researching the Las Bolsas forest area, which is between Cerro Horqueta and the Pianista Trail. Had been lying under a redwood tree about 50 meters from the trail, he said. And these German authors also confirmed that this spot is near La Pandora de los Naranjos. My Spanish is horrible. At the end interesting, of the Piedra del Lino trail, which is the same trail which Pedro from the hostel claims he told Chris and Lisanne to walk instead of the Pianista trail on the day of their disappearance. So these German authors, they managed to read the transcript of Carlos's interrogation, and it reads that Carlos put on a glove after he found the long blonde hair, and that he carefully stowed away the bag and its content in a rucksack. He then took everything straight to Sinaproc in Alto Boquete. But when Carlos was contacted by Sinaproc again, a brief time later, he was informed that the hair had been misplaced or lost. And Carlos was told that they could not find the hair anymore. So this is not just a rumor now, this is actually in the files. But then the media spin started, and in the media this blunder basically was spun out to involve just the temporary disappearance of the plastic bag, and the lost hair was totally ignored, it wasn't mentioned anymore. So we now learn from this book Slip that the Personeria officials actually also found the matter strange. And Carlos was asked by them to come along to the Sinaproc office, and under oath he declared to them that Sinaproc members did not touch the bag at the instructions of a direct superior. Instead they were told to pack the plastic bag up in an empty box from a US military catering company and to seal it. And the next day the box was picked up by the DYYP, which is Panama's equivalent of the FBI in a way, and it landed on the desk of Personeria manager C, who is not further, the name is not further disclosed, which was on April 24th. And this local investigator, quote, breaks the seal, takes the items out of the bag, and then records in writing that she has sent the food packages inside to the EMELCF biomolecular laboratory to have them analyzed for bodily fluids and fingerprints, end quote. But the plastic bag and the shoe sole were not part of this analysis. So they were merely photographed in the box, and they were then, wait for it, destroyed. No forensic investigation was done whatsoever on them. And the reason given in a note was that it was unsuitable as evidence and easily spoiled. Okay then. So the expert involved was also not pleased at all with this, and in the investigation report is an angry note from this expert stating that the chain of evidence had not been recorded correctly, that the expert had no idea who else had this bag in their hands already, and that also no useful traces were found. So this was just a plastic bag. So it was just a mess. And there's just been no mention anymore at this point of this blonde hair that was found by Carlos. So this is damning information, and this is probably why Adelita Coriat dedicated a newspaper article to this topic. So like I said, was this due to incompetence or malicious intent from Pitty and her team? I mean, that's up to you to decide. I know that people have different views on this, which is totally fine. We don't have to all agree on things, but the German authors, they are pretty straightforward in their judgment, and they say the Lost in the Jungle authors put so many untruths in these statements that we can hardly assume that it's due to just a lack of research. So yeah, they also don't believe Pitty. There's also another interesting discovery by these German authors, by the way. There are actually 2 autopsy reports of Lisanne's leg bones, which come to different conclusions. So this was very peculiar to read. And the other Dutch book, they went with 1 autopsy conclusion, and they kind of forgot about the other, failed to mention the other, failed to mention the discrepancy between 2 completely different autopsy outcomes. This is new info and it was just wow. I was very surprised by this. So this is a quote directly from this German book, Still Lost in Panama. To close the case, the public prosecutor instead presents Lisanne's parents with the remains of their daughter on September 24th, which is Lisanne's 23rd birthday. They pass them on to the NFE, where scientists discover that Lisanne's foot has 3 metatarsal fractures. According to the EMELCF autopsy report from Panama, however, these fractures did not occur. In his report of June 19th, Wilfredo P., so the Panamanian autopsy specialist, writes explicitly about the examination of Lisanne's foot. Quote, the tarsal, metatarsal and phalanx bones were dissected and exposed and no bone trauma was found, end quote. However, West and Snoeren, so the Dutch authors, they state in their book that the EMELCF has already diagnosed the fractures, although they should have known better. It wasn't true. They found no fractures. This should once again raise the pressing question of whether events like this happened at the request of their co-author, Betsaida Pitti. As early as 2014, the public prosecutor needed something to support her accident theory. When she publicly declared the case closed, she claimed that the women had died because the river system had dragged them to death after they had somehow fallen into it. In her reasoning, she cites the same metatarsal fractures and periostitis diagnosed by the NFE as evidence for her assumption. According to her explanation, only a fall from a great height could have caused these injuries. Pitti's statement leads to the conclusion that the girls fell from a bridge, a monkey bridge. According to Dutch forensic scientist Frank van der Goot, covered in my blog a lot, who examined Lisanne's foot, the fractures are not necessarily the result of a fall. They could also indicate a phenomenon that occurs in inexperienced hikers who suddenly start walking for a long time. Pitti's evidence for a fall therefore results mainly from the diagnosis of metatarsal fractures, which her institute ironically failed to detect, and from periostitis, which her institute attributes to environmental and occupational medical influences. So this is fascinating. As I said, I covered Frank van der Goot, who basically involved himself in this case voluntarily. He was not sent to Panama. I think it was in early 2015 actually that he went there in January. But he wasn't sent as an official from the Dutch delegation. He went there on his own initiative, and I made a bit of a mockery of him because he's quite a media savvy person. He loves the cameras, and he just went on a hike on the Pinista Trail, and then he pointed at some slope. There are not many slopes, but he pointed at one. He said, well, this could be the place where they fell. And he didn't provide any evidence. Actually, during the searches, all these slopes that do exist, they were scaled down. So right after the disappearance, by professionals on ropes, nothing was found. And of course, you can say, well, if they fell there, they didn't stay there, they crawled somewhere else. But if you look for these signs very early on, there are so many indications when 2 adult women and their bags roll down a slope. You can see the way branches or foliage is broken. They looked at all of that. And also the remains of these girls, the backpack, the sunglasses that were inside the bag, they were without a scratch. They were not broken. So if you roll down a high slope, you expect some damage, and it wasn't there. But Frank van der Goot in front of the camera, he was like, yeah, this is the most likely explanation. I think he made a complete mockery of himself. But anyway, here he is again, Frank van der Goot, who, as far as I now understand from this German book, he actually did the second opinion of these bones of Lisanne. So how is it possible that we had to wait until, 2024 to find out that there are in fact 2 different autopsy findings, and that Betsaida Pitti ignored the first autopsy report from her own country's forensic institute, only to have this Dutch forensic Frank van der Goot do a second opinion with a totally different outcome? And then his findings of these metatarsal fractures were instantly used by Betsaida Pitti to sell to the world her accident theory. And until that point, until the discovery of the bag, she basically said, this is an investigation into a kidnapping, basically. And then as soon as the bag was found, the whole narrative switched. All investigation into criminal avenues was stopped right away. How can professionals in Panama, who were the first actually to investigate these bones, not find these fractures? And how come these Dutch authors never pointed out this discrepancy between these two clashing conclusions? So this is a bit, I don't know what to believe. If it's true the way these German authors present it, I do wonder if that second autopsy finding was actually very convenient, if it's actually truthful or not. And Power Pity actually said, 3 fractured metatarsals. Did Pity have someone intentionally break Lisanne's foot posthumously? And actually, now that I read this, I went back to some older information, I gathered everything on my blog, and I think we may have had an early indication already that something was not quite right about this sudden broken bones claim, because in the Break Free documentary, which aired on Dutch television, which interviews the parents and the family and loved ones of Lisanne, I have it on my Vimeo channel. Peter Vroon, so the dad, says, well, that was a big surprise when people from the NFV came to our house to explain the report, and only at the end they say that they also found that some bones in her foot were broken. So I looked at him like, how is that possible? End quote. I don't know how he meant that. In light of what we now know, I wonder if he refers here to this sudden change in verdict, because they would have also known that the initial Panamanian verdict was that there were no broken bones, and now suddenly there are a lot of fractures, so strange. Or maybe he meant it in another way. I don't know the exact context he meant it in, but to me it reads like this is a surprise, and this was quite late. This was not in the beginning, because the Dutch actually did this autopsy much later. So after September 24th, when the remains of Lisanne were shipped to the Netherlands. And of course I can't review the entire book, because it's a huge book. I just picked out a few topics of interest. But the author, for instance, also wrote about Pity, quote, in interviews her conclusions sometimes seem far-fetched. For example, she's asked why the girls went behind the Mirador in the first place. Her baffling answer, it was known that Chris and Lisanne felt more comfortable in Bocas del Toro than in Boquete, which is probably why they wanted to walk back there. So this is what Betsaida Pity said in the press. It's like unbelievable and bizarre. Did this daft woman really think that because Lisanne was a bit homesick in Boquete that they would have wanted to hike all across the country for at least 66 kilometers as the crow flies, so even longer if you actually walk that trail, in their shorts and tank tops without any extra water or food or supplies? They went behind the Mirador because they were doing a day hike. It's obvious. So then we come to the main chapter in this book, which is about the red truck, and it links to their theory about Mr. M. I will evaluate this topic in more detail because it's important to the authors. And they first detail the known story. So witnesses who lived on the Pianista Trail saw a red pickup truck going up and down the trail on April 1st. And on the afternoon when Chris and Lisanne disappeared there, they actually saw this truck. They reported it. Someone wrote down the number plate because it's quite unusual. I think many people have seen various videos about the penis trail by now and what it looks like. And yeah, it's a very narrow trail. It's littered with rocks. It's really not easy to access by car. You can go up until a certain height, but you cannot drive all the way to the Mirador. And it's probably only locals who really know the place who go by car at all on that trail. So police took their time interviewing the inhabitants of the Penista Trail and finally did so on April 16th, so about 2 weeks after the disappearance. But you have to remember that this disappearance case has many inconsistencies, and one of which is that almost a dozen of witnesses came forward saying that they saw 2 girls who were matching Chris and Lisanne's description heading up the Penista Trail around 2:30 p.m. And this is definitely not matching with the photos on Chris and Lisanne's digital camera and their mobile phones, placing them already on the summit by 1 p.m. So they could never have gone up by 2:30. But in any case, multiple witnesses declared also that they saw Chris and Lisanne go up the Penista Trail, but that they never saw the girls come down again. Instead, they saw this red pickup truck come down the mountain at the end of the afternoon. And among these witnesses interviewed by police were 66-year-old Olivia de Cam. She features in my witness video here on YouTube. And also her 74-year-old husband Dario. They live at the start of the Penista Trail and you can hear them talk in a witness video I made. So they told investigators that they saw a burgundy red pickup truck come down the Penista Trail around 3 p.m. Olivia noticed that the tipper part of the car was dirty and covered in leaves and foil, and that 2 passengers were constantly guarding it. Dario felt suspicion, and he was the one who wrote down the number plate. And in the book, we get basically a rundown of what is known about this and what is in the case file, so it's very interesting. There are also the statements of Aristides M. and his mother Inaida. They also said they were surprised to see a red pickup truck with tinted windows come down the Penista Trail between 4 and 4:20 p.m. 2 days prior, so on Sunday, March 30th, Inaida had already seen a cream-colored van with several strange tattooed men drive up the Penista Trail, which was causing her irritation. And then there's another set of witnesses, the owners of the Il Penista restaurant, so Giovanni S. and his wife Doris, who we already know from the dog Blue. They witnessed the red truck with blacked out windows driving up behind the restaurant between 4 and 4:15 p.m. They saw it come down again roughly 25 minutes later. So rumor has it that various witnesses saw Edwin Sabrazon Aguirre drive the red pickup truck. This cannot be confirmed by the 2 German authors because Edwin refuses to talk with them and witnesses don't want to say anything about it. But the authors do write that Edwin's parents have restaurant chains in local points in Bouquet. And Edwin is linked by some to the disappearance of Chris and Lisanne, mainly by the Daily Beast journalist and podcast maker Jeremy Kreiz, because the mother of murdered Pandilla gang friend Osman Valenzuela, she spoke out in that podcast and shared with the world that her son had been afraid of his life the days before his young death. And this happened while surrounded by his Pandilla friends at the Caldera swimming spot. And I covered this podcast series extensively on my blog and also into videos here on my YouTube channel. So if you know nothing about it, go check them out because they play a big part in this book also, mainly by the authors going against that theory. But back to this red truck, this has always been an interesting topic, I guess, because Betsaida Pitti also communicated about this truck in the Dutch book. And her story was basically that there's really nothing to this story. She stated that the red Toyota pickup belonged to a local man who rented it to dispatch flowers and plants that day along the Penista Trail for the Bouquet Coffee and Flower Fair. And thanks to authors Hardinghouse and Nenner, we now know in more detail what is actually written in the case files about this red truck. So we now learn from Still Lost in Panama that the police used the license plate information they received from Dario de Cam, and it led them to a 1993 Toyota Hilux pickup with a single cab. And this car does not match with the witness testimony of Aristides M., who stressed during his police interview on April 16 that he had seen a new car on the Penista Trail and not an old car model like Olivia and Dario de Cam declared to have seen. And what's more, Aristides emphasized that he had not seen a Toyota Hilux, But this did not deter the officers. They identified the owner to be a woman with the initials of AA, and she lives only about 500 meters from the language school, Spanish by the River. When she was questioned by police on April 22nd, AA stated that her husband E.G. drove the truck and that he probably rented the vehicle to the Bouquet Flower Fair on April 1st. Her husband then confirmed this, but he said that he had no written record of this and it had been a verbal agreement, and they borrowed that car and the couple could in exchange then dump their household waste in the flower fair's container. So for beside of pity in the Dutch authors, that was enough proof that there is really nothing to this red truck narrative. But the German authors, they have a different view, because collecting plants at the Pianista is prohibited by law. And the story of the husband, E.G., is that the administrator of the flower fair, called Sidney Taylor Jimenez, who since passed away, had some employees pick up some mosses and ferns and foliage at Mr. M's place, who owns 2 cabins up the Pianista mountain. And Sidney could show a gas receipt plus a note with Mr. M's address written on it. And the driver EP declared to have driven the truck up there around 11:45 a.m. and back down again by 4 p.m. on April 1st. He said he saw no tourists on the trail that day, told police that he drove back up to Mr. M's property again 2 days later, on Thursday, to pick up some more orchids. And this is contradicted by Sidney, the administrator of the flower fair. So okay, we know now that this red truck went up and down the Pianista to collect flowers and mosses etc. at Mr. M's place, both on April 1st and on April 3rd. But for these German authors, Hardinghaus and Nenner, this story forms actually the basis of their own crime theory. Which is the Mr. M theory. And this is new. I didn't know anything about this person until reading this book. Hardinghaus and Nenner believe that Mr. M may be involved in the disappearance of Chris and Lisanne, and that when the red truck came down the Pianista a second time on April 3rd, that could link to the most likely time, according to them, for the mobile phones of Chris and Lisanne to have left the Pianista area. And the immediate issue that creeps up then is of course that the Pianista Trail has cell reception, and the phone logs indicate that neither the mobile phone of Chris nor that of Lisanne ever contacted the cell tower again. But the authors have an explanation for this. They write that since the phones were only switched on for a few seconds by Thursday, April 3rd, the girls and their phones may have been whisked off the Pianista and into an area with a signal when the phones were powered off. And now, of course, I would say that the same argument can be used to make a case for Chris and Lisanne having been kidnapped to any other part of the region by then, but okay. Hardinghaus and Nenner call the pickup truck ominous and its story inconsistent. They link it to the disappearance of Chris and Lisanne solely because the truck was seen in the same area as where Chris and Lisanne were last seen. Quote from the book: "In addition to the comments of all the eyewitnesses to the truck, according to which they claim never to have seen the vehicle before or after at the places cited, are highly suspicious. The contradictory statements of those who claim to have lent or rented the truck speak the same language. Perhaps the perpetrators used a camouflaged vehicle to shield the area at the top of the trail and let Chris and Lisanne fall into the trap. An abduction from the Pianista Trail would have been possible between April 1st and April 3rd, due to the search not yet having begun. Even if Chris and Lisanne had already fallen into the clutches of their kidnappers on the day of their disappearance, they could have been hidden behind or in front of the Mirador for a while longer, for example in a lonely hut on the hillside. However, this possibility was never further investigated by police or by Betsaida Pitti. Then the German authors zoom in on this Mr. M, and they write that he used to run a trendy nightclub in Bouquet and was involved in drugs and women in the past. His property is high on the Pianista Trail and it used to be the scene of wild parties, we're told. And he's also friends with a tour guide Plinio, who sometimes posts pictures of himself on M's property. There are 2 sturdy, boarded up huts on this 500 meters of land of Mr. M, but he himself does not live up there. He only appears on certain occasions. The authors write that this man has been given a nickname in Boquete because hardly anyone knows his real name, but they call him Mr. M. And according to Hardinghouse and Nenner, Mr. M may have seen Chris and Lisanne after they went up the Pianista. Because neighbor Lazaro has declared to police that one day after the disappearance, his neighbor, Kenny G, observed two women in the paddock on the slope in front of the summit. Quote, they had been followed by a man with a tattooed shoulder and a cell phone to his ear. So, okay, the neighbor of a neighbor says that. I would say it could be hearsay, but the German authors believe that the key to the disappearance of Chris and Lisanne lies in this particular story. This neighbor's neighbor, Kenny G, also declared to police that on April 2nd, between 6 and 6:30 p.m., he was on his way home via the Pianista Trail in the direction of the Mirador, and he was accompanied by his mother and brother, he said, and he saw two girls in shorts on a hill near the mountain range, and before they could talk to him, these girls disappeared. Quote, but the girls could only have gone one of three ways, either towards them, in the opposite direction up the summit, or eastwards to M's estate. And the German authors have the theory that they went to Mr. M's property. The German authors then describe how police showed barely any interest in this Mr. M, and they claim that he was the only resident of the Pianista Trail who wasn't officially questioned by police or who had given a sworn testament in connection to the disappearance of Chris and Lisanne. And I guess we just have to believe this to be true because we don't have the case files and I don't know, there is no hard evidence presented to support this, but this is their claim. Quote, since his property is located exactly where Chris and Lisanne were last seen alive by Lazaro, this is an inexplicable mistake. I guess everyone should have been investigated, also Mr. M. And apparently the police also received an anonymous tip by phone that the girls were murdered by a foreigner and that the bodies were buried in a field behind the Arco Iris farm. Now, there were more anonymous tips over time, pointing in different directions, but this particular Arco Irish farm belongs to former President Mireia Moscoso, who is accused of massive corruption after her term of office ended in 2014. But when police searched the described area, they found absolutely nothing. So we know that Chris and Lisanne expressed interest in visiting waterfalls in the area, and Hardinghouse and Nenner write that a secret waterfall on the Pianista, and they call it the Cascada El Pianista, is located actually roughly at the same height as Mr. M's property. They don't indicate just how close or how far that waterfall is located exactly from this property of Mr. M, but in order to reach it from the Pianista Trail, they say you have to walk through the dangerous triangle between M's hut, the ex-president's dairy farm, and the sugarcane field where the bodies might have been buried. So they were not found in that field, the bodies. Mr. M's hut, it is not investigated, so we don't know. And dairy farm, yeah, they found nothing there either, but they now make it sound like there is this Bermuda Triangle up there, the dangerous triangle. I'm not yet convinced, but it's interesting. So the German authors, they proposed the theory that locals familiar with the waterfall could have lured Chris and Lisanne into a trap under the pretext of taking them to this secret waterfall. They were then led off the trail towards Mr. M's cabin, and this Mr. M may have had the opportunity then to hide Chris and Lisanne up there and then whisk them off in the red truck later. They even believe that Cineproc were heading towards Mr. M's property by the time they were contacted to say that the searches were called off for that day. They think that's very suspicious. But they don't provide any evidence that that phone call to call off the searches early on was actually done because they were heading to Mr. M's property. That's just speculation. But I guess this is an original theory, and it is of course also very interesting to find out now that Bedside of Pity and the Dutch author duo were selectively reporting on this red truck in their book, They were leaving out quite a bit of details we now find out about this red truck. They didn't mention Mr. M at all, and they concluded that there is no link between this red truck and the disappearance of Chris and Lisanne. They basically provided no further details about this whole flower fair stuff and didn't mention that it was illegal what was done there. So Power Pixie, Dave and myself, we do think there could be something of interest in this red truck story, but for us there is a different link actually, which we personally deem stronger. For us the connection with Cuervo and his flower business is the stronger one. A short reminder, in the podcast of Jeremy Cried, Osman's mother, Margarita, explicitly says that she learned through Murgas, who was also killed soon after, that this Cesar Cuervo S was directly linked to the disappearance of Chris and Lisanne, and that they were murdered in his house in Palo Alto. So there is a connection between Cuervo's flower business and his father's connection to the Bouquet Flower Show that year, which is not mentioned in this book. Although it must be said here and remembered that Bouquet at the time at least was full of red trucks, but they link the red truck to this flower-growing resident Mr. M. And to be honest, I'm a little bit underwhelmed by the evidence they present for this theory, especially in light of them excessively trashing any theory regarding the Pandilla being involved or Edwin. So, but it is their theory, so there you go. So what is our take on this theory? So I'm talking about Dave, Power Pixie, and myself. They helped me with the blog post I uploaded on my blog about this book review, and they are fellow sleuths, I suppose, who just help me look at things from a different angle sometimes and chime in and keep the discussion going. So one thing that stands out for us is, for instance, that we don't understand makes April 3rd, quote, the most likely time for them to transport Chris and Lisanne away from the Pianista in that red truck, and we wonder why April 3rd. April 2nd was also a day when the iPhone was only very briefly used. How could they have been hidden, unheard, unseen in Mr. M's property for those days, so close to the Pianista trail where people were looking for them? To me it seems that once thugs kidnapped Chris and Lisanne, they really only had to make sure those phones were powered off as soon as possible and before connecting to the network again. And this was done for a fact shortly before 6 p.m. on April 1st. And then for 14 hours there was no phone activity, which in theory allowed them ample time to take these women and their phones anywhere really in Panama. And indeed, once those phones were systematically powered on and off again from April 2nd onward, there really is no need to assume any longer that these phones were in a zone with sparse cell reception. They could have theoretically been in a cellar, in another forest, in a Faraday bag even. Anything could have happened to them in those 14 hours when the phones were powered off. And that is also the only reasonable explanation, in my opinion, for this powering off. There's just no way that these two lost or injured women would rationally or instinctively power off both their phones during this first critical night in the jungle. It's just, I know that there are people who try to make it sound like Chris and Lisanne were so rational that they instantly recognized that they could be in that jungle for weeks, and so they instantly both powered off their phones to save battery. But the facts just don't support this, because Lisanne's phone was left powered on overnight on the 3rd, and she basically burned through all her battery then without using the phone for anything other than checking a weather app. So this could not have been down to saving batteries. It just makes no sense. But another obstacle for us to believe that Chris and Lisanne might have been taken to one of these huts of Mr. M is that you then have to believe that it was a completely random and spontaneous event. There must have been dozens of similar opportunities since for this random person to snatch vulnerable women off the trail. I mean, for instance, Annette herself climbed to the Mirador solo. She walked the Pianista Trail alone, and did she ever worry that Mr. M, living nearby, might have taken her off the trail? She never wrote about that, so no. So you have this event then, which was never seen before or since, and we're asked to think about Mr. M here. I mean, someone who Chris and Lisanne never met before, as far as anyone knows. So Power Pixie Dave and myself believe quite a bit of what Jeremy Cried and Margarita claim in the podcast series, simply because Margarita has communicated early on that her son had been threatened in the days leading up to his death. It was even reported in the early days already in local media, and also because we know from reliable locals who wrote on the Bukettening forum at the time that Osman was murdered, and also that the local gang showed up at his funeral to taunt and disrupt the service. So the German authors, Hardinghaus and Nenner, are very biased here, we feel, because they write in their book that this whole funeral disruption never happened, and they're wrong. These Germans, who were not even in Boquete at the time, they do not know better than actual locals and expats who were at that funeral what happened. So they do not know better than actual locals and expats who were at that funeral and who honestly wrote about it immediately afterwards on that local forum, dismissing this real event by two German authors who basically present themselves as case authorities because they obtained the case files in unknown fashion. They don't tell us how they got these stacks of files, if they just applied for it, if someone shoved it their way, if they used money or influence or whatever to get them. But we have now several authors, and in Perfect Plan we have various people who have these case files, Jeremy Cried as well, and they all come to different conclusions. So I don't know if you can say of yourself or pretend to be an authority just because you have these files, which clearly are not solving the case. Now, as you all know, this case is unsolved, so these are just theories in the end, because there is a lack of investigation done at the end of the day. But when Hardinghaus and Nenner come with their Mr. M theory, we come with Cried's Pandia theory, and for us this was not a random attack by a mere stranger. We suspect that it was a calculated and coordinated attack, although still a crime of opportunity, but that Chris and Lisanne met the Pandia, who were youngsters of their own age at the time. You have to remember that Lisanne had been very homesick in Boquete. There was also the disappointment of being sent away in a rude manner by Maria Elena of the daycare center, something which Lisanne had planned in great detail beforehand. She didn't like those surprises, so that affected her too, and both Chris and Lisanne were very disappointed about this. They communicated how disappointed they were in their diaries to their parents. They were let down in Boquete. It's as simple as that. And if you look at what they did in KOUDEKAAS, Chris and Lisanne, they actually had a blast going by their diary entries, their photos. Their friendship with the Dutch guys, Bas, Edwin and Mart, had been the highlight of the trip basically. And we believe that in order to deal with all the setbacks in Boquete, Chris and Lisanne could have been open to hanging out with locals their own age in Boquete as well. So swimming, chatting, just like they did in KOUDEKAAS. And Margarita tells us all that Murgas confided in her before his own untimely death. And he says that Chris and Lisanne had met the Pandia in Boquete, and that is why religious Osman was murdered by the Pandia, because his conscience was playing up and because he knew what happened.